financially. Politically, the price has also been very low. We have not ever seriously interfered with the domestic politics of our allies in Europe. And there's been no real limitation on their foreign policy either. They have essentially had the kind of policy they would have had anyway toward the Soviet Union. I mean, assuming they were not dominated by the Soviet Union. And the same thing is true of the Middle East, of the Third World policy. And perhaps more fundamentally, there has been no American opposition to the creation of a very powerful European economic bloc. A bloc really created against us, and not against us in the sense of some unremitting hostility, but against us in the sense of a sort of economic balancer to this enormous American economy. We haven't objected to that. On the contrary, we have been among its principal promoters, and we have also encouraged the Europeans to develop a political dimension and even a military dimension in recent years to this European bloc. Again, then the price has been very low. And it's not surprising that the Europeans have continued to welcome this American role in Europe with great enthusiasm. Why have we done it? Well, there are all kinds of reasons, again, which are fairly familiar. Culturally, after all, Western Europe is that part of the world other than ourselves, where economic liberty, political liberty, are deeply implanted and reliably practiced. It would be a very lonely world for the United States if we were somehow or other alienated from Western Europe, or if Western Europe were ever dominated by the kind of Soviet Union that existed after the Second World War. Economically, Western Europe, of course, is the other great center of economic power in the world. We'll talk about this later on. But in its GNP, in its population, in the quality of its infrastructure and its education, I mean, it is the only other center of the world that rivals the United States. And Japan, of course, it does in many respects, but Japan is much smaller than Europe. So it's not surprising then that the United States has felt it a vital interest to maintain an alliance with Western Europe. Geopolitically, the alliance with Western Europe has been the means by which we have been able to contain the Soviet Union on its own home ground. Essentially, the Russians have been boxed in within Europe itself. That has not only preserved the independence of Western Europe and the independence of this enormous agglomeration of economic and political power that Europe represents, but it's also given us, allied to Europe, an extraordinary preponderance of power in the world as a whole. It's that alliance with Europe which has given us the preponderance, which has allowed us to shape much of the rest of the world into a kind of global Pax Americana, something which, for all of its faults, is not so different from what we dreamed of during the Second World War as a kind of great liberal, open, global economy. Behind our ability to do that is this alliance, which has given us this great preponderance. If something happened to that alliance, if the United States were alienated from Western Europe, or if Western Europe were allied to something else, then it would be a very different world. And so for all those reasons, the fact that we have been and continue to be eager to preserve this connection should be no great mystery. It's still anomalous the way this connection is organized. Europe has three great military powers, for example. France, Germany, and Britain. Two of them have nuclear weapons, nuclear forces which have to be taken seriously because they are increasingly perfectly reliable second strike forces. And in the case of the French, though they collaborate with us, they've essentially developed this themselves independently of us. Now, and as I said a moment ago, they have a GNP which rivals ours. They have an infrastructure which in some respects is better than ours. They have the technology, they have education, and they have all of those things. Why then this extraordinary military dependence on the United States? Well, that's been the question to ask for a long time. Incidentally, this European agglomeration, if you like, greatly exceeds the force that's available in the Soviet Union. That's true to some extent even in military terms, but certainly true in economic and other terms. So it has almost for a long time. The next question is why has the relationship suddenly come into question now? And why does it seem to be changing so rapidly after this long sleep? Well, there are three obvious developments. All of them have been maturing over a long period. First is the collapse of the Soviet post-war strategy. The Russians have tried to maintain a certain role in the world. It's too much for them, basically. They have essentially paid a very heavy price in terms of their own domestic development as a nation for this kind of military role, which is pretension of theirs, which they have not gotten very far with in the end, in any event. They have, on the other hand, developed quite a lot domestically. They've developed to the point where they are now profoundly dissatisfied with their present condition, and where they realize to go any farther requires major changes, development of infrastructure, a whole change in the way their economy is run, and with that, a whole change in the way their society is run. They have created a whole new class of people who we would find rather familiar. And those people are basically fed up. And in a sense, Gorbachev represents those people. Where all this ends, nobody knows, but that it is a profound change that can be, it seems to me, no question. At the same time, there's been an erosion of the American post-war world, a post-war role in the world. There are lots of signs of this. I'll return to it in a moment. Finally, there's been the coalescence of Europe into a world force of its own. The most obvious case of that is the so-called Europe 1992. Taken together, these things constitute an evolution away from the bipolar world into a more polar world. Into a more plural world. A world in which there are not just two superpowers, but several great powers, and which is created by the relative decline, if you like, of the two superpowers, including the United States. This is a world, obviously, not just of the Europeans, but of the Japanese, of third world states, of China, of India, possibly of Brazil someday. Now, this decline of the United States is a relative one and not an absolute one, something which I discovered cannot be said too often. There's no reason why the United States cannot remain the world's leading power for the indefinite future, the meanest, toughest, biggest, strongest, whatever. But only if we find a strategy to adjust to these changes. And the real fear of the declinists, so-called declinists, I mean people like Kennedy, and I suppose to some extent myself, is not that there's a kind of endless deterioration of the United States in view, but rather that we will fail to adjust to changes which are inevitable. And as a result of that, we'll suffer from what Kennedy calls overstretch, a misuse of resources to maintain positions that really can't be maintained anyway, with the result that we will do serious harm to the springs of our own economic and political vitality as a nation. And that will bring on not a relative decline, which is inevitable and beneficial, but will bring on an absolute decline, a real weakening of the United States, which is not at all inevitable and is certainly not beneficial. This will be historically stupid in the sense that we will not have risen to the occasion of our own success, because these changes in the world are largely the result of our own policies. They are things that we have encouraged ever since the end of the Second World War. It's not a failure then of American policy, this more plural world, but it's a sign of its success. We wanted Europe and Japan to recover. Well, they have. And as a result, they're inevitably much stronger in relation to us, economically, politically, even militarily, than they were in 1950. We wanted the third world to develop. Well, it has developed. At least some of it has developed. And as a result, we have some very formidable industrial competition now from places like Korea, Taiwan, maybe someday from China and from Latin America as well. They're also much harder to push around. I mean, as we've discovered in Vietnam, and the Russians have just discovered in Afghanistan. Even with the Soviet Union, our policy was never to destroy the Russians, but to contain them. And as a result of this containment, we've given them, in effect, 40 or 50 years of peace, which is no small gift given Russian history over the last 200 years. And it's not surprising that Russia Russia is a much more developed country for all of its internal problems at the moment than it was at the end of the Second World War. So this is not a failure of the United States faces. It's rather a challenge of adaptation, but with very high cost if we fail to meet that challenge. Now, obviously, I haven't got time this morning to discuss all of these changes, the Soviet changes, the European changes, the American changes. Let me focus on the declining American position in NATO, because it's, first of all, an important element in the whole global situation. And it's a good case study of why the relationships are changing, and also how adjustments ought to take place or could take place. This erosion of the American position in NATO has taken place for both military and economic reasons, reasons that are obviously linked. Militarily, the United States has been essentially an American nuclear protectorate, in the sense that it has depended upon what we call extended deterrence, as you know. That is to say, the willingness of the United States to start a nuclear war rather than see Europe overrun even by purely conventional forces. That is the foundation of this American military role in Western Europe. Now, it was easy enough to take on that commitment in 1950 when we did take it on, because we were essentially invulnerable to any kind of Soviet nuclear attack. It's obviously a very different commitment now, in a period of nuclear parity, more or less, between the superpowers, and then one in which we are, in any event, as vulnerable to them as they are to us. It's also a different world in the sense that it's no longer simply a bipolar world, but as I mentioned earlier, there are other nuclear powers, and among them are Britain and France, two European powers. So the military situation has changed, and the commitment has changed in its basic character. Nevertheless, we have gone on with it, indeed we still go on with it, but it has become increasingly unstable. We have and have had since the late 50s, a basic conflict of strategic interest with our European allies. From our point of view, if there is to be a nuclear war in Europe, we want it to stay there. Under no circumstances do we want it to spread to the United States, which is not difficult to understand as a basic strategic principle. From the European point of view, their basic interest is if there ever should be a war in Europe, including a major conventional war, they want it to spread to the superpowers as rapidly as possible. They feel this way not because they'd like to see the Americans and Russians destroyed, although I suppose in the middle of the night they must have thoughts of their stuff. They could then go back to doing what they really enjoy, which is to fight with each other. But rather because they think that's the best way to prevent a war. Their nightmare is that the superpowers will get it into their heads that they can have a war in Europe and not have it spread to themselves. That we can try out all our toys on each other, but in Europe, and not have it spread. And so there's been a basic conflict of interest between us and the Europeans. We've managed this by a strategy called flexible response, as you know, which is to say that we would build up in NATO enough of a conventional force so that there would at least be a big battle in Europe if the Russians were able to attack conventionally. It is not thought to be a genuine balance in the sense that we could defeat an all-out Russian conventional attack, but we could at least make it a major battle. Such a big battle that the use of nuclear weapons then becomes highly probable. And that's been the compromise. It satisfies us a bit in the sense that at least we don't have to start a nuclear war over any kind of Soviet incursion. And it satisfies the Europeans in the sense that it's not a big enough conventional force so that it makes it obvious to the Russians that we wouldn't use nuclear weapons in a Soviet invasion. The Europeans have taken out some insurance on this in the sense that the British and French forces were explicitly designed initially as a way of triggering a superpower war in case we were reluctant. They would attack the Soviet Union, the theory went, and force a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And secondly, of course, both the British and French have withheld to a great extent their own conventional forces from Europe, just to make certain that there isn't a big enough conventional balance so the Russians would think that they could get away with a conventional war that would not turn into a nuclear war. This has worked well enough for 30 years, but it's very expensive. It's particularly expensive for the United States. Because of our fear of nuclear escalation in Europe, we have felt it necessary to go on running European defense all this time, conventional as well as nuclear. Doing that has meant we've had to have an American Supreme Allied Commander, which is the way NATO has been, as you know, from the very beginning. And in order to go on with this role of taking charge, so to speak, we have felt, not unreasonably, but we need a large force of our own there, or at least available to go there. As a result, we have 10 out of our 18 standing divisions, 18 standing Army divisions for NATO. 5 of those divisions are in Europe, 5 of them are back here. That's obviously very expensive to maintain. It's very expensive for the United States to have to go on having a large, heavy conventional army ready to fight in another continent. Much more expensive, as I said earlier, than it would be for a country that lived there. And the figures about all this are very clear, it seems to me. The United States spends, it is said, $150 billion annually on NATO. That is to say, roughly half our defense budget. Those are the Defense Department's own figures. They're terribly elusive, these things, as you can imagine. But still, it's very large. Whether it's 150 billion or 170 or 130, who knows? It's big. That figure of 150 billion is roughly twice the combined defense budgets of France and Germany put together. At the same time, France and Germany have ground forces which are about 80% of ours. That suggests there's something wrong somewhere. One of the reasons is, as I mentioned earlier, the Pentagon. But another reason is it just costs a lot. We have a great comparative disadvantage in maintaining forces for Europe. What this means in per capita terms, again, rather startling figures. The Germans spend something a little over $300 per capita on defense. We spend somewhat over $1,000 per capita on defense. And half of that $1,000, I would think, goes to Europe. This has grown hard to take in the context of our own fiscal problems of the last few years. And the arrangements have grown more and more unstable, both for strategic reasons, this problem about extended deterrence, but also for economic reasons. There's been a great demand for burden sharing, as you know, which essentially means we continue to run everything, but other people pay more. We've done quite well with this formula. But it has obvious limitations, as you would expect, and it's begun, I think, to reach the end of its usefulness. From a military point of view, there are really two solutions to this problem of extended deterrence, it seems to me. One of them is that the Europeans ought to have a deterrent of their own. If they're worried about the willingness of the United States to start a nuclear war, well, they ought to be able to do that themselves. They actually do, of course, have the forces. The French deterrent is now very respectable, as I say, independent. The British, equally so. The problem is to find a political arrangement to cover the Federal Republic, or for the Federal Republic to have its own nuclear weapon, something nobody professes to want. But if they don't want it, then it's incumbent upon them to come up with some arrangement which covers the Federal Republic. This is not to say that the American deterrent should be withdrawn, but rather there should at least be a parallel European deterrent committed to the defense of Germany. Or the other alternative is a conventional balance. If people don't want to rely on nuclear weapons, which many people in Europe don't, then have a conventional balance. The problem is that the United States really can't provide either of these solutions. By definition, we can't provide a European nuclear deterrent. In the sense that it's something that we run. We've tried this, you know, we're putting missiles there and so on. It's basically a scam in the sense that if we control the missiles, they're not a European deterrent, they're an American deterrent. And so we can't provide the European. We can give them the nuclear weapons. They don't need them because they've got them. And the same thing with conventional forces. We cannot provide a conventional balance for Europe. We're essentially going broke as it is. Trying to provide the forces that we do. There cannot more specifically, there cannot really be a conventional balance in Europe without the French. There's no way that you could seriously think about a conventional defense of Western Europe if France is not part of the arrangements. Just geographically, I mean, quite apart from the resources involved. Now, the French have made it clear that though they appreciate the alliance, are happy to belong to it, are in some ways our closest ally in some respects in Europe, they nevertheless will not belong to something run by us. There's an obvious solution to this problem, which is, okay, run it yourselves. And that is a solution that many of us have suggested. That's what we mean by devolution, which is not that we should withdraw from Europe, not that we should give up our nuclear deterrent for whatever it's worth in defense of Western Europe, or not that we shouldn't continue to keep some kind of substantial forces in Europe, but not 10 divisions for Europe. And that the part of the quid pro quo is that the Europeans should run these things themselves. And that we will give up the management. Now, the problem is whether the Europeans will rise to the occasion. I won't spend time discussing why we shouldn't withdraw, although if there's any time for questions, we can certainly discuss that. I think the arguments are self-evident. This raises the question, then, what about Europe itself? What's happening in Europe? How plausible is it to imagine that the Europeans would rise to the occasion in this situation? And that brings up this question of Europe in 1992. Is Europe the next superpower? Is a sort of popular question which is asked all the time. Well, as good academics, you know that you deal with questions like this by fussing about definitions. First of all, what do you mean by a superpower anyway in the present context? And what do you mean by Europe in the present context? It's clear that it's not the next superpower in the sense that it's somehow going to push aside the United States and become the next global hegemon. The whole point of a more plural world is there isn't going to be any boss in the world in the sense that there has been, but there will be several major powers. The question is whether Europe, whether some kind of united Western Europe will be one of them. Well, certainly the resources are there, as I've said now several times. The economic resources are there to put them together. It is a rival to us. In some respects, it's bigger than we are. Even militarily, as I've argued, there are plenty of military resources. The question is, will they be put together? I mean, in what sense does it make sense to talk about these European great powers as if somehow or other they were a single force in the world, even in their own defense? Well, one way that they would be is if you had a federal Europe. That was the old idea, the kind of imitation of the United States, in the sense that all these states would come together, the states would give up their states' rights, and you would have a central government parallel to the American government. It hasn't developed like that. And I don't think it will, and it's a large subject. But let me try to say a few things about it. If we look at what's happened in Europe, it's a much more complicated pattern, this European unification. The national states persist in the common market as the centers of political loyalty, as the centers of political policy, the centers of political will, in a sense. What has developed in Europe, well, let me say something else, they also remain very different from each other. We've just completed a decisive study of the 4 big West European countries, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. And the astonishing thing is, after all these years of integration, how very different the political structures are, and to some great extent, how very different the economic policies are. So what has happened is a process not of identification, but a process of harmonization. They have achieved and sustained a remarkable degree of integration of these distinctive policies and structures with each other, in the sense that they have maintained a reasonably open trade with each other. And they have maintained exchange rate stability. And 1992 most certainly will push all these things forward. They will get rid of more barriers to trade. They will open up their markets to each other. And they will probably strengthen their capacity to maintain a monetary union, all of which is very important and a very major political achievement. But they've been able to do this through a rather complicated mechanism in Brussels, in which the national policies are negotiated with each other, rather than replaced by some new central authority which makes policy for everybody. Now, this is very interesting from a theoretical point of view. Why is it necessary to have something like Brussels if you want to have free trade in the contemporary world? Well, I think the short answer is that in the 19th century you could have free trade because the government didn't have much to do with the economy. In the 20th century, and especially in Europe, the economies are corporatist, in the sense that the government is intimately involved with shaping the economy. And it doesn't matter what the ideology is. This is true of Mrs. Thatcher's England as it is of Germany or France. Modern governments are very much involved in the economy. It's obviously true in this country as well. So if you want to maintain free trade, real free trade, among countries that are very close to each other, you have to have perpetual negotiation among the bureaucracies, among all of the regulating agencies of these economies. And that's what Brussels, in effect, has become. Now the question is, why are the nation states doing this in Europe? Are they losing control? Are they losing their sovereignty? Again, that depends on the definition of sovereignty. If by sovereignty you mean some abstract idea that you can do anything you please, well then of course they are losing their sovereignty in the sense that this binds them into a structure of mutual consultation, mutual deference, and working out their policy. But in the real world, you can argue, sovereignty never was like that. Sovereignty is the ability to get what you want and to have some kind of control over the conditions within which your country lives. And from that point of view, this arrangement in Brussels, where these states negotiate with each other at every level, all the time, is a great enhancement of sovereignty, in the sense that these states have much more control over their real environment in this structure than they would have if they were not in this structure. Because then they could maintain their independence, but at an enormous economic cost, which they don't want to pay. So this is a kind of way of squaring the circle, if you like. And it's a very interesting political form. Now, on the other hand, this is a structure which depends very much on a common political will among the states to keep the whole show on the road. If the states haven't disappeared, then of course in theory they all have the right to walk in another way. And that is, of course, the great political problem in Europe. It makes particularly important the role of the French and the Germans, because they have I hesitate to use the word axis, but they have as a sort of partnership in this new Europe, they have in many ways been the executive of this system, in the sense that when those two countries have agreed on a common policy, the rest of Europe is tended to follow. When they have not agreed, nothing happens. It's also true that they, in their own way, have the greatest commitment to Europe, whereas the British have always been very intimate, as we know, and to some extent so have some of the smaller countries, who are always drawn into a kind of connection with the Americans or whatever, rather than going too far in this European direction. Well, we come back then to the question of what is Europe as it is developing. In particular, how will this Western Europe develop given the changes in the Soviet Union? And there's a very critical issue that our president talked about today. That is, what is the meaning of a united Germany? Does it mean that this whole Western structure will fall apart because it will upset the internal balance of these Western states? In particular, it will upset the French-German connection upon which everything else has really depended. And Europe will go back to its old games, you remember, in which there was either an alliance between the French and the Russians against the Germans, which was the case before the First World War, or an alliance between the French and the British against the Germans, which was the case in the interwar period. Back to the old game, the old struggles, and the old disunity, which has ultimately meant this partition of Europe, which has taken place after the Second World War. I don't think it will happen. I don't think it will happen for a variety of reasons, which I'll try to say very quickly. One is the Soviets don't want it. In the last analysis, they don't want German reunification, it seems to me, and they're still very much in a position to prevent it. Perhaps more importantly, the Germans don't want it. I think this is true not only of the West Germans, but I begin to suspect of the East Germans as well. On the West German side, there is a very great awareness of this historical pattern that I've just been talking about. The Germans are quite aware, first of all, in their own history, a united, centralized German state is a very rare phenomenon. I mean, as you know, it started in 1866 or 1870, and it ended in 1945. Not the happiest period in German history, or the happiest period in European history. And they have no desire to recreate it in the form that it existed before. There is very strong diffidence in West Germany about recreating this Bismarckian centralized right. It will also upset the internal balance in Germany itself. West Germany has been a great deal more agreeable as a state than the old Imperial Germany ever was, partly because the people there get on with each other much better than they would if they had Austrians, the Prussians, and Saxons. So I think there is great internal diffidence in West Germany. There's also a huge collective interest in keeping together this Western core. There are all kinds of economic opportunities in the East, but there are all kinds of economic realities in the West. I mean, you know all these figures that the German trade in the East is 6% or whatever, German foreign trade. Not that the potential isn't great, but potential at the cost of what? And in that sense, I think they will develop a kind of confederal arrangement in which East Germany will be loosened up along with Eastern Europe, but the Germans will refrain from coming together and upsetting this fundamental balance. Now, in the long run, this has very great possibilities, because a strong Western European bloc, which develops more intimate relations with the Russians, in a sense leads the Russians back into a global system, and Eastern Europeans as well. It offers the possibility of a new concert of nations, if you like, to face whatever problems the next century will bring, which I'm sure will be formidable. In a sense, this Pax Americana of ours will have evolved into something rather splendid, in the sense that it will have surmounted the Cold War, and in a sense, this European grouping becomes the catalyst then for leading the Russians back into some kind of world system. Now, one final point, and that is, what about this confederal Europe itself? How will it fare, assuming that it does develop as I'm suggesting? How will it fare in the long run? Very interesting question. We have, in our own country, one model for how to run a continental economy. I don't think it's quite time to give up on it, but we have a lot of problems. We have great difficulty finding the right way to manage this country properly, and the difficulties are becoming more and more acute, in my view. The Russians are another model to how to run a continental economy. It doesn't work very well either. Both in their quite different fashions, the American and the Russian model are examples of centralized government. Maybe that's not a thing to say in Utah, but from Washington it looks like that. The European structure is very different. It is that you leave as the real centers of vitality, economic and political, the nation states, but that you find a way to link them together in some kind of cooperative structure. Who's to say what will work better 50 years from now? I leave you with the thought that it's a very interesting question, and it doesn't seem to be easy to answer. Thank you. Those of you who if you have questions, I'd like to talk through yourself as well. We can take a few minutes for that. Any questions or comments? question. I don't know if I know what the answer is. I think the principal reasons for what the Soviets are doing are entirely internal. It may be that two other considerations about 1992 may be affecting Russian policy. I mean, one is the realization that this pretension of trying to run Europe, which in theory they've had all along, is obviously silly and expensive, and this is a final step, or not a final step, but another major step in the creation of this West European force. And so it's an incentive for them to try to come to terms over the question of Eastern Europe and East Germany and so on, rather than persist in something which is expensive, not only because of the military forces they have to keep, but also because it precludes economic collaboration, which might be very beneficial to them in trying to modernize and so on. I suppose there's a second possible consideration, which is that the best strategy for slowing down, or maybe even preventing this European coalescence, is to start the deal now. If the coalescence takes place, they're going to have to deal anyway, but maybe they can weaken it now, cause enough dissension among the Western powers so that they maybe could be in a better position. Western Europe having fallen apart and the United States having more or less withdrawn, to have the kind of preeminence in Europe which they had hoped for originally. So I suppose it's a combination of giving up on the one hand, and on the back of their minds the thought that maybe there's something in it for the future.
I think in the 90s, political conflict and independence was talking about international reviews arising out of crisis situations. Do you think that sort of easing can be seen in the year of 92 as this crisis situation demand, and they need to therefore that?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the crisis situation for the Soviet Union is itself. I think that it's not that Europe, they don't think a lot about what's going on in Europe, but I think they draw the conclusions of that as just suggesting, one is that they better come to terms with this, because they're going to have to if it succeeds, and maybe they can have more influence over what happens if they do participate now rather than later. Yeah.
There's so much talk about this Europe 1992, and I find it kind of fascinating because I don't see where Europe has ever really been able to get together on a whole lot of anything throughout its entire history. Like you said earlier in the election, one of their favorite things is to fight amongst each other. And without the United States, they'll go back to doing that. Do you think that this whole thing will come together, and if it doesn't, what kind of things would prevent it from coming together?
Well, that's what I was trying to talk about a bit. I mean, the major thing that's changed is that they're not alone in the world anymore. The United States and the Soviet Union are unlikely to disappear beneath the waves, and there's always what is rising in Asia, which they're probably as concerned about as we are, maybe more. So that they realize after whatever it is now, after two world wars, that it's very expensive, this business of fighting with each other. And if they don't want to be dominated from the outside, they have to pull themselves together. They're not willing to give up their traditional states in order to do that, but they are willing, it seems to me, to give up their traditional way of operating with each other and to create something new, which is this confederal structure of Europe. I'm very impressed with the confederal structure of Europe. That's what I was trying to suggest. When you consider the enormous difficulties to economic integration, which politically is much more difficult than military cooperation. Military things, I mean, are fairly obvious. You have an enemy, the Russians, are sufficiently disagreeable so that, that it's obvious why you need a military balance. Whereas economic integration enters very intimately into the politics of every country, all kinds of interests are touched. And to be able to sustain a regime, if you like, of increasing liberalization, very difficult politically. They've done it. And they've done it basically very well. And they've also done it during a very difficult time. I mean, the 1970s is a very difficult time economically for Europe. All kinds of shocks from outside. And a kind of low-grade recession all through the period. They've had to get their own fiscal spending in hand. They've had to restructure their industries. To some extent, they've had to lower real wages, or at least have very high unemployment. I mean, all those things have been difficult to do, let alone to do them more or less in harmony with each other, but they've done it. So I am impressed with what they have done, and think that structure is a lot tougher and a lot more resilient than many people do, even without 1992. It has all kinds of problems, but then who doesn't? I mean, I'm trying to write a book about the American economy at the moment, or the American sort of economic government, if you like. I must confess, the Europeans aren't the only people with troubles. And look at the Russians. So I mean, I think we have to be careful every time there's some difficulty or every time there's some failure to assume that the whole structure is somehow collapsing. But I think it is. Now, this German question and this whole business of the opening of the East, is a very real issue, as I tried to suggest at the end. But as I say, I don't see in Germany the willingness to sacrifice everything that's been built up in the West for the sake of an adventure in the East. The Germans certainly want to end the situation where East Germany is a kind of prisoner. The Germans in East Germany have no kind of basic political rights, and their standard of living is so low. I mean, that's intolerable. They are Germans, after all. And the people in the West can't forget about them. I mean, it gnaws at their conscience, even if they don't like them very much. Which is certainly true of the Bavarian view of the Prussians. But once you could create a system, an arrangement where they were much more open, where the standard of living was higher, then the pressure for formal centralized reunification, I don't think would be there. And I see more and more signs of that, including large numbers of German friends who keep saying, why are you Americans pushing so hard for this German reunification? We don't want it. You're crowding us. I mean, I was told that as late as last week by a rather high German official. I'm optimistic, I guess is the short answer. Sorry, yes, please.
I'd be interested to hear your comments about the events currently taking place in Eastern Europe, and specifically Hungary and Poland, and the possible implications of that for Western Europe, the common market, the NATO alliance. Just yesterday, I think I read in the paper that Shepard Nazi said that they don't have any plans to intervene in the movements in these countries in Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact countries. You mentioned that the Soviet Union didn't want these kinds of things to happen, a reunification of Germany. Do you feel that those comments are sincere on the Soviet Union's part, that they really don't intend to do that? And if that's true, then what does that portend for the common market and the future of Europe?
Well, I think what is certainly true is that the Russians don't want it. It puts Gorbachev in a very difficult position. He would have to do that, might even destroy him. And anyway, I mean, it's difficult. They don't like to do it. May not work. All sorts of things. And it'll have a very heavy cost in terms of relations to the West. All that. If the Eastern Europeans, can't keep their own changes under some kind of reasonable control, they don't run through the streets hanging Communist Party leaders from the lampposts and so on, as they would want to do in '56, then the Russians, I think, won't intervene. The one exception to that, I think, is Germany, and there is this whole question of what kind of military connections will they keep with all of these countries. They will do their best to make those military connections not seem to be an interference in the domestic policies of those countries. around on the fact that those countries too like a sort of security blanket which the Russians have provided them. And they too will, insofar as the Germans begin to have more and more influence in Eastern Europe, they will begin to be happy that there's some counterbalance to the Germans, and therefore will try to keep their Russian connections. I suppose that's the long-term bet, and it's not such a bad one, I think. But it does require a certain degree of self-restraint on the part of the East Europeans. What is remarkable, in my view, about the way that the Poles and Hungarians have behaved is that restraint. I mean, who would have thought that Poland would suddenly have developed this extraordinary political sophistication in skirting between remaining subservient to the Russians and not doing things which the Russians simply wouldn't be able to accept. I mean, it's been a remarkably skillful performance. If they can do as well in terms of their own domestic politics, and then they're well on their way, it seems to me. Now, the other side of this, I think, is that the West Europeans have to be careful, and the Germans themselves have to be careful to exercise enough self-restraint. Not to go barreling in such a way that alarms the Russians, that looks as if it's a kind of Western invasion of Eastern Europe, and particularly a German invasion of Eastern Europe. But not to alarm the Russians, and B, not to alarm for the Germans, not to alarm the other West Europeans. I think the German government is perfectly aware of this. They are trying to use the common market as the machinery for harmonizing a lot of these policies with the East. How well it can work, I don't know, but it's a bet on everybody's common sense and reasonableness. But there are strong incentives for that to succeed, I think. Yeah.
Is the United States taking steps to take advantage of the Europe 92? Are they, getting prepared? I've read a couple of things like we're lagging behind in preparing to take advantage of trade advantages and things like that. And what can we do better to?
Well, I don't know specifically. I mean, we've been negotiating endlessly and complaining, trying to chisel a bit better deal for ourselves, which is part of the game. We are, I think, concerned about it in the sense that we're afraid that the Europeans will go protectionist on us, in the sense that they will have so many problems from this increasing integration among themselves, so many disruptions, they just simply won't be able to handle a big open economy to the outside world. It'll take time to sort these things out, and in the meantime they will become more protectionist, and they'll get the habit, and it'll be difficult to break, and we will be paying ourselves for a considerable part of European economic integration. We feel that way strongly about agriculture. With some reason, although our own agricultural policies are not exactly blameless either, and it raises a whole issue of whether you really can expect agriculture to be subject to free trade anyway. Big issues. I think that our principle, my own feeling is we should worry less about the Europeans and more about ourselves. I mean, our principal problem is the lack of competitiveness ourselves, and in particular, this kind of monetary policy, which both for our own economy and for the world economy is a kind of loose cannon. I mean, this business of the dollar, jumping from 2 Deutschmarks to 1.5 to 2.25, all in the course of a few years. I mean, that is hardly a way to encourage liberal trade. Imagine what it means to a supplier, a manufacturer, a merchant having to deal with exchange rates like that. And if people finally say the hell with this and start putting up barriers against this kind of disruption, who's to blame them? So I mean, if we're really worried about protectionism, we have a major contribution to make, it seems to me, which is not negotiating about tariffs, but getting our own affairs in order. So I guess.
What are the prospects of reducing our military involvement in Western Europe?
I think they're very high. I mean, they're almost inevitable at this point. Among other things, because of our own fiscal problems. I mean, the military budget has been more or less frozen, and has in fact been declining in real terms. It's declining in another way, which is maybe more telling, and that is that given all the projects we have on the books, whose costs keep escalating, partly because as they develop further, they cost more, and partly because we don't have much control over the cost anyway. The military budget is more and more squeezed, even if it stays the same, or even if it does increase somewhat, and it's not going to increase.
Would you apply this to Asia as well?
Well, I think so. I mean, I'm not sure that the geopolitical situation is as ripe for what I would call a policy of devolution. I mean, I really don't know enough about it. And I don't know really how much it costs us, but that there is a basic parallel, which will certainly come to the fore over the long run. I think there's no question.
We have a base in the Philippines for almost a century.
Yeah.
Seems to me like it's awfully difficult to extract yourself, even though the geopolitical situation suggests otherwise.
I think that's true, although I think it's also true that we've been quietly making provisions for getting out of there. Maybe you end up with something much smaller. When I say I'm diffident about pronouncing out all of this, it's because I think it is true that our military role in the Pacific has created a kind of peaceful structure, which has made it possible for a lot of these countries to develop the way they have. But whether we have to go on with that indefinitely, or can, or should, especially given the competitiveness of these countries in our own markets, seems to me seems to me a rather big question for the future. I realize that simply making overall list of the Japanese is not very popular, even with the Japanese, let alone with anybody else in Asia. And I think that's a bit simple-minded as a way of dealing with this. But something like that, some more indigenous kind of security structure, I think we'll have to develop. It doesn't, to be fair, it doesn't begin to cost us what the European business costs. Yeah.
Are you saying then that what's going to evolve out of this will actually be a more secure international system than the bilateral of these two superpowers? Because you've said that the American presence in Europe, and you just said even in the Pacific arena, has helped these states to increase economically. What I'm wondering is if the multilateral system comes back into being, then isn't that going to lead to an arms race or a reduction in the growth that we've seen in the past 40 years?
Well, I hope not. There's a question of, there are two different issues, aren't there? I mean, one is a multilateral system as stable as a bipolar system or a hegemonic system? That's a very abstract question, in a sense. If you no longer have the conditions that make a bipolar system possible or a hegemonic system, I mean, you can argue that the nicest system for everybody is a benign hegemon. Takes care of everybody's security problems, doesn't interfere with them too much, encourages growth and so on. And I think that's not a totally unreasonable description of the United States over much of the post-war period. But there's no point in nostalgia over that kind of a system if you don't have the basis for it anymore. And much worse than striking out for some kind of multilateral system, which a balance of power system, which is stable, is trying to hang on to a hegemonic system when you can't do it anymore. That's what produces, in my view, the certainty of failure, in the sense that the hegemonic power begins to do all kinds of things which destabilize the system as well as ruin itself. It does such things as run very large deficits internally, externally. It borrows money on a colossal scale. It manipulates its currency. I mean, all those things are much less promising as a way of running the international system than trying to build a multilateral system. I think those are the real alternatives.